Tonight's event is part of our year-long series on oral history and the future, archives and embodied knowledge. And the premise for the whole series, for those of you who weren't at the first event, is that oral history is always a conversation about the past that's happening in the present, and it's oriented towards the future. And so in the series, we're asking, how do we make that future orientation real? Do we do it by putting things into an institutional archival repository for people to use? Do we do it by telling the story to someone who will take it into their body and remember it and physically tell it to somebody else? And what are all the practices in between those two kind of poles? And how does the way that we think about the future shape the way that we do our oral history practice in the present? And so Sujatha Fernandes' work, I think, fits into this in a really interesting and dynamic way, where she's really thinking critically about how the kinds of stories that we tell in the present about the past shape the particular kinds of futures we can imagine. In the field of oral history, we've been having, over the last couple of years, some really dynamic conversations about how oral history can be used for social justice work, and also how storytelling can be co-opted by neoliberal forces that push us into hearing and telling stories about sort of individual achievement, about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, about overcoming your obstacles, that hide more than they tell us about how the world really works, and that actually can keep us from being able to think about and imagine the kind of structural change that would really lead to a significantly different future. So I was so excited when this book came out. I was even more excited when I found out that Sujatha, who's based in Australia, was going to be in New York in October for a book tour. And so I want you to join me in welcoming her. I'm going to give a little bit more of a formal bio. Sujatha is a professor of political economy and sociology at the University of Sydney. Previously, she was a professor of sociology at the City University of New York, and we almost crossed paths at the Grad Center where I got my PhD. Her work focuses on the cultural politics of global labor and social movements. She's the author of what I think is an astounding number of books, 3 academic books: Cuba Represent, Cuban Art, State Power, and the Making of New Revolutionary Cultures, Who Can Stop the Drums, Urban Social Movements in Chavez's Venezuela, and her latest book, Curated Stories, The Uses and Misuses of Storytelling, which I brought for her to sign. She's also written a memoir of global hip-hop entitled Close to the Edge, In Search of the Global Hip-Hop Generation, and a children's book, Don't Throw My Teeth on the Roof, which I have not seen, and I'm pretty excited to look at, actually, given the title. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Nation, and American Prospect, among other places, so she's not only a really astounding and important scholar and activist, but an exemplary public intellectual. I want to mention that this event is part of the Paul F. Lazarsfeld Lecture Series, and we're grateful for that support. I'm going to pass around a sign-in sheet if you're not on our mailing list and would like to be. And with that, I would like to welcome and hand it over to Sujatha. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for inviting me here today. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Amy, for all the work that you've done, and to the Oral History Program for organising this event today. So, like Amy said, my work connects to the themes of oral histories because mobilizing stories is one way of using oral histories to shape the future. And so today I want to talk about the uses of narrative in organising for social change. And so I want to sort of talk briefly about some of the arguments in my book in relation to narrative and storytelling. But I also want to focus in particular on one of the examples that I talk about in the book, which is the example of the domestic worker movement in New York City. So my approach to looking at stories and storytelling is very much about method. And I've been very influenced by oral historians in the work that I do, people such as Daniel James, who say that we can't just take oral histories and people's stories at face value, but we have to read them, we have to look at the tropes, we have to look at the kinds of language that people use, and try to understand what's shaping those, right? How can protocols, how can workshops, how can trainings, how can all of these various things actually shape the stories that come out? So it's a different kind of reading of stories and a different kind of reading of those oral histories that I'm attempting to do in the book, and that's a little bit what I wanted to talk about today. So I want to just begin by talking about my general approach towards this topic of storytelling that I deploy in the book. And the overall argument is that we sort of exist in this moment when there is an emergent culture of storytelling, what I call curated storytelling, that attempts to shape and abbreviate and give sort of predetermined storylines to the narratives that surround us. And there are a few sort of, this is the book that Amy had showed. And there are a few sort of reasons for that. I think that we are surrounded by all of these phenomena, like, for instance, TED Talks, right, that present stories and speeches as completely spontaneous, completely natural, and in fact are the product of a vast number of sessions, rewrites, people being asked to focus on something in particular, but actually they are heavily curated by a small number of people who sort of determine what help determine what content goes into that talk. The Humans of New York, you may have heard of this as well, which is a whole sort of series of attempting to document the real lives of real people, right? Whether it's New Yorkers or whether it's, he's gone around the world and taken people's stories. But again, it's another example of curated stories. What goes into those stories? How are the stories framed? What kinds of things are they attempting to communicate? We kind of live in this moment, I argue in the book, where all of our stories are being shaped in particular ways, and where suddenly storytelling has taken on a whole importance, right? We talk a lot about telling your story. That you can actually hire a content strategist who will come to your business, come to your nonprofit meeting, come to your school and tell you how to tell your story, right? And it's part of the culture we exist in, where we all kind of need to brand ourselves. We need to come up with a story for ourselves, whether it's the way we curate ourselves on a sort of Facebook feed, or the way we curate ourselves on an Instagram account. But we're all used to now this kind of way of curating ourselves for the world, telling our stories in a way that makes it appealing, palatable, that's going to make us stand out on a Twitter feed or a Facebook feed, that's going to draw somebody's attention. And there's a kind of acceptance that it doesn't have to be the real you, right? You can tell a story that presents certain aspects of yourself, that molds yourself in certain ways, that present a version of yourself to the world that you want the world to see. And we don't necessarily go onto Facebook expecting to see, the real things that are happening to our friends. We expect to go on seeing the version of themselves that they want us to see, that they want to put forward into the world. And so all of these things are, about making stories accessible, about simplifying our stories, about curating them, about presenting a version of ourselves that we want the world to see, and also accepting that that's what other people are doing, right? This is the sort of broader context, I argue, in which we see this kind of model of what I call curated storytelling. So what I'm interested in the book is not just, that's the broader culture that I'm interested in, that I think shapes the background for how we understand this storytelling. But what I'm really interested in the book is how that curated storytelling gets channeled politically, right? So politically, what happens, how the way that we tell our stories now having a broader impact in terms of political organizing, in terms of social justice campaigns, in terms of the way that nonprofits and advocacy organizations do their work. That's really the sort of key theme of the book. And for me, one of the really interesting people I could trace a lot of this back to is a political strategist called Marshall Gans. So some of you may have heard of him before. He was an activist within the civil rights movement. He then moved to California and became one of the key leaders of the farm workers movement with Cesar Chavez, and he is somebody who was always interested in developing storytelling. So he now teaches at Harvard, where he does, of course, he's a lecturer in narrative and storytelling for political change. But when in 2008, during the Obama election campaign, he was actually employed by Obama to come up with what was called Obama Camp, which was strategy sessions, getting people to tell their stories in order to elect Obama, right? So this is kind of the model that he used at the time. He said, well, we have a story of us, we have a story of now. We start with a story of self, which is your personal story. We move that to, telling a story of now, and then a story of us. That's his kind of key, formula that he uses for all of his storytelling. And what happened during the Obama election campaign was that Marshall Gans kind of organized across the country, mobilized large groups of people to take their stories, their personal individual stories, and turn them into campaign stories. So that what he called it was the 2-minute story. You had to take your life experiences, you had to sort of get rid of all the complexity, the nuance, all of that stuff, that's the baggage that's around it, and you have to be able to say, this is me, this is my crisis point that I reached in my life, that's when I realized I had to vote for Obama, will you vote for Obama too? It had to be all sort of fit into these 2-minute stories. And so people around the country were kind of mobilized into this model, and then that was replicated in many ways, and it was like the sort of campaign tone where people called up, said, this is who I am, will you vote for Obama? This is my story, this is my life story, will you vote for Obama? And so that sort of model of curated storytelling between 2008 and really for Obama's 2 terms in office became an extremely widespread model, because Marshall Gans had an organization called the New Organizing Institute, where he produced pamphlets and training material, and it was duplicated and it was kind of sent all around the country. And so you had climate justice movement using this. It was very, very predominant within the undocumented student dreamer movement, who were pushing for the DREAM Act. And what you saw was these kinds of very, very specific training manuals that word for word almost told people how to tell their stories, and didn't really like the LA Dream Team, a dreamer organization in Wisconsin could be using exactly the same manual, but their conditions of course are quite different. They're very different scenarios, but it was this kind of one size fits all. It was the idea that you could fit into tell your what's your problem, what's the crisis point you reached, what's the choice you made, and then what was your goal, whether it was fight for the DREAM Act, fight for comprehensive immigration reform, elect Obama, re-elect Obama, whatever those goals were, they were sort of tacked onto the end of this story model. So this is kind of what the book is looking at, and it's trying to understand the impact of politically the impact of these 2-minute stories, which of course became extended to probably 5-minute stories in some of these cases, but still these very kind of brief stories. What the impact that was, what kind of impact that had across a range of different movements, and how storytelling, legal advocacy storytelling, all the different forms of even rally storytelling was impacted by Marshall Gans and his kind of training modules. Now, I'm just giving Gans as one example, because I don't think he's really the only one. The more I did research, the more I was amazed at the reach of this model. But it's as I was showing with the earlier image. It's not just that. It's also that now a lot of nonprofits, a lot of foundations, contract their own content strategists or people, storytelling specialists, who'll come in, who'll talk to your group and tell you. I mean, it's more often sort of seen in media trainings, where you're told this is how you tell your story to the media, but it's also, seen through these kinds of, storytelling workshops, where telling your story and learning how to tell your story effectively is seen as, the way in which you can, achieve whatever the goals are for your organization. Okay, so just to sort of tap into.
You hear everyone in the room go, oh.
Well, this is so. The oral historian Alessandro Portelli has been, one of the sort of really key people that I've gone to understand this phenomena. And I think, in trying to understand what has happened, how do we understand this boom in storytelling today? I returned to his work and especially his really important insights about how when we tell our story, we use different modes, right? We use different modes, and we often naturally just shift between these different kinds of modes. So we have, for instance, first we have the personal storytelling mode, and the personal storytelling is just the kind of I was born here, went to school there, this is what happened, parent died, I got married, had a child. It's the everyday details of somebody's life story, and it's that register on which we narrate what happened to us as individuals and as people. Then the collective register is the one that links us into the community, the workplace, the neighborhood. It links us into the kinds of broader structures in which we live, and a part of our story, right? When we narrate what, where we are, we might make reference to our ethnic background, we might make reference to our the kinds of community where we were born into. We might make reference to the unions that we were part of. It's this collective element is the world in which we have social connections, and it goes beyond the individual. And then the final is the political structure, and that refers to the sort of political context, the political sphere, how our life experiences may be shaped by, the politicians in power, the political decisions we've made, who we vote for, and even more broadly than that, the kinds of political economic structures in which we live. So these are the three, and for Telly, we very much move from one to the other, and we make sense of our life stories by moving between these two, right? And usually one is dominant. So if somebody's really focused on, just what it meant to them to have a child, say, or their experiences, moving to a different city or something, there's going to be like a real emphasis and focus on the individual. If, as in the case of the historian I mentioned before, Daniel James, he's talking about, say, a trade union activist who's narrating her experiences. With trade unionism, maybe that emphasis and experience is going to be on the political or the collective. So when we tell our stories, depending on who we're telling it to, why we're telling it, the reasons we're telling it, usually one of these aspects is dominant, but nevertheless, they're sort of constantly shifting between these two. So my argument is that with the sort of boom of curated storytelling, what we've seen is a shift away from the collective and the political towards much more personal storytelling. And when I say personal, I mean seeing yourself as an individual, presenting yourself as an individual, that the collective and the political become more and more excised out of your story, and it sort of becomes an example of you as an individual against these kind of forces. So for instance, when, and I'll talk about this more later, when domestic workers tell their story to the media, or the way in which the media then relates their story is very much about this poor, abused, harmed domestic worker who suffered in these particular ways, who was facing a really bad individual employer, that employer needed to be reined in. That's why we need a Bill of Rights, because so this kind of individual storytelling, or with the dream, the undocumented dreamers telling their stories about, I was brought to this country as a child by my parents. I didn't have a say in it. It's only when I got to college, when I got to finish school, I realized I don't have a green card. I can't go to college, right? And so the sort of actors in the story, the emphasis on the story becomes quite personal in terms of how the stories are narrated and what the sort of aims of these stories are. I think like a different way of thinking about some of these stories would be to see them in terms of, like, if we go back to in the early days of the women's movement, for instance, right? When women might tell stories of being abused by a spouse, and then link that to broader sexism, or link that to patriarchy, or think about the structures in some ways the way that the Me Too movement has done today, but to not just leave those stories as me versus my employer, or me versus my inability to get into college, or bad parents who brought me here. But it's very much about thinking about the class or the community or the structures of sexism or racism or patriarchy that shape our lives. And my argument is that's what's missing. That's what kind of drops out of the picture. And it's only when those community and political elements can be brought back into how people tell their stories that I think that we do have the potential for these more subversive stories. And so as Patricia Ewick and Susan Silby have argued, subversive stories recount particular experiences as rooted in and part of an encompassing cultural, material, and political world that extends beyond the local, right? And so there is something about seeing ourselves as just individuals, as our stories, as just our own, that kind of feed into this much more simplified, curated storytelling. And it's when we're able to see ourselves as connected to other people, when we're able to recognize our experiences as not just me as an abused spouse who's, facing this problem with my husband or partner, but it's when we're able to say, my abuse is not just faced by me, it's faced by many women. And like I said, that's why I think the Me Too movement has been so successful in saying, women who face sexual harassment are not just individuals, against their boss or against somebody who's perpetuating this, but this is a broader societal problem. And I think it's been quite successful in kind of bringing out that's one example I would say of those some of these stories are examples of those kind of subversive stories that are able to move out beyond the individual and to make a sort of a broader connection. Right, so I want to move on to talking about the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights campaign. And to also talk about the use of narrative and the use of storytelling in this campaign. Just to give you more of an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about curated stories. So just to give you the sort of background to this campaign, in August 31st, 2010, a coalition of domestic worker groups won a historic Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in the passage of this bill in New York State. And the campaign was led by an organisation called Domestic Workers United, or DWU. And between the years 2004 and 2010, so a period of 10 years, DWU enlisted a whole multi-ethnic coalition of organisations from CARV, Underlain, Haitian Women, Haitian Refugees, Unity House Cleaners, Damayan Migrant Workers Association, and later Abikar for Human Rights. So these are all of the organisations that were brought into the Bill of Rights campaign, and they worked together over this period of 6 years to bring about this Bill of Rights. And so, the question that I'm sort of interested in is how do they use storytelling? What kinds of stories did they tell? And what impact did storytelling advocacy have in terms of the goals of that movement? Just to tell you a little bit how I got interested in domestic workers, because my earlier work, as Amy mentioned, a lot of my earlier work was in Latin America. I worked in Cuba, I worked in Venezuela, and so this was, my first book, really, my first research looking at the US, and it partly came about because since I moved to New York in 2003, I had come to know through my sister and others, I'd come to know about the work of Domestic Workers United that was organizing against abuses of domestic workers and nannies in the city, and trying to get them to organize themselves, to get better wages, to get better conditions. And so I actually, in 2008, my daughter was born, and I wanted somebody who could look after her once a week when I had to go into work for a few hours. And so I asked Domestic Workers United, and they suggested this worker called Pat Francois, who came, and she looked after my daughter. And over the course of, I think, about 6 months that she was looking after my child, I talked a lot to her, and I learned from her all about this campaign that she was involved in. And she would come with her, her DW buttons on her bag, and she would come with her flyers and say, "Hey, Zal, can you for me?" And and she was really talking up and talking about the campaign. And so that it was through her and through really learning a lot about the work that was being done that I sort of decided that I would do my next project, partly because having children makes it very difficult to travel anymore to Cuba and Latin America and do research all over the country, in other countries. And so that was when I decided that, to do the research with Domestic Workers United. So that was actually where the book began, was looking at the case of storytelling in domestic workers movement, and then moved out to looking at other examples and other cases. So there's a few questions that I had about this storytelling advocacy. So that and I'll go into this in more detail about the different kinds of
stories that were used, but first of all, you know, the sort of the idea of storytelling advocacy. What is that? What do we mean by, you know, by sort of using stories for social change? What do the stories do, right? I think that often we can just say, well, you know, that they're telling their stories, they're trying to convince people that this is how bad their situation is. But I wanted to go a little further than that to say, what is the actual effect of these stories? What kinds of, you know, tropes, what kinds of images are they drawing on? What kinds of ideas might they reinforce or challenge? These were all the questions that I was having when I first heard about it. And one of the things that I want to make a distinction between, because it's something that I found really crucial, was how storytelling was used within the movement by the domestic workers and how it was used outside the organizations, how it was used in the legal sphere, how it was used in the media, how it was used in other sort of official venues. And so if there was an area where I thought that there were really some positive things that I saw in the way in which storytelling was being used, I would say it was how they were used in terms of movement building, right? And so what I heard when I was interviewing the workers and talking to them was so much of what was positive about the stories was the ways that they helped alert them to the fact that they were not alone in terms of what they were suffering, in terms of what they were, their experiences, what they were going through. They would sit in a meeting and they would hear somebody else talk about how painful, you know, their experiences were. They would hear somebody else say how difficult it was that to be treated in this way, to be treated as less than human. And in hearing each other's stories, they began to realize they weren't alone. They began to realize that sense of commonness, of solidarity. And so I think that was a really powerful aspect of it. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So this is just a quote from one DW member, Sujatha Fernandes, and she says, when she came to her first meeting, she says, I found myself there very excited and enthused and hurt at the same time because I was sitting there listening to the story of a domestic worker who, when she came to this country, spoke very little English and now had enough English to tell her story. And every domestic worker in that room, in that meeting, had tears in their eyes. It was a story of not just physical abuse, it was sexual abuse. It was abuse in every form and it was very painful. And after listening to her that day, I just knew that I wanted to be a part of this movement that makes changes. So this kind of anecdote that she told me was something I heard a lot when I was interviewing domestic workers about how hearing other people's stories about this kind of movement sharing of stories really inspired them and made them want to be involved, made them want to continue to be a part of this struggle. And at the same time, in one way we can sort of see these kind of stories as therapeutic, right? You hear the story, you feel like it validates your own experience. It's a form of witnessing. But at the same time, they were also, these stories were also the basis for people's organizing efforts. And so Nina Graul from the organization Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees, she was working with domestic workers to gather stories for the 2005 Human Rights Tribunal. And the way she described it to me in the interview, she said all of us were breaking down because the stories were so emotional. She was saying that the Haitian workers, the Haitian domestic workers, originally they felt ashamed and afraid to tell their stories, but that it was through sharing and through telling their stories that they became more outspoken and they gained that kind of confidence. Another organization called Underlain, Organizing South Asian Workers, this group started with just groups of domestic workers sitting around a kitchen table telling their stories to each other. And they also, really valued this ability to connect with each other and to use stories as a way of diagnosing, of analyzing their experiences. So I think the argument that I want to make is that there is a power and a value to this kind of internal storytelling that helped build the movement and helped unify the movement. Now, the difference I see is when we move to the legal and media storytelling. And here there were a range of different ways in which domestic workers told their stories. So, for instance, they told these detailed narratives of their lives and abuses that they suffered to legislators. They sent written testimonies. They would send these regular stories to Albany, where they recounted abuses that they had suffered. And over the course of the 16 campaign, domestic workers shared hundreds and hundreds of stories. And when I was doing my research and I was looking at some of the archives of GWU, and I was looking at, just collecting media stories, I came across so many stories. This campaign kind of just generated tons of stories. So the thing that I argue about these stories in the legal and media, and so if you remember, that's different to what I'm saying about how stories were used within the movement. This is kind of a different kind of storytelling. And I think that on the one hand, we could argue that these stories did create broader sympathy by, having a prominent story. And so Pat, the domestic worker who I mentioned at the beginning, who babysat for my daughter, I didn't realize that she had come to me literally 2 weeks after she'd been violently abused by one of her employers. And slowly that story came out, and she was involved in a very big court case against him. He was a very prominent sports agent in New York City, and he had punched her after she questioned something about how he was talking to his daughter and treating his daughter. And Pat was somebody who told the story over and over. She told the story at the court hearing. She told the story over and over at Albany. She was featured in a very big article in the New York Times magazine, which had, a big picture of her on the front and a very sympathetic portrayal of her story. And she's somebody, and again, she would tell her stories in different ways. She'd tell it to the media. She'd talk about it at a rally. She'd talk about it at Albany. But again, this was, this kind of, to me, a way in which how telling your story can kind of shame those people who would abuse a domestic worker, who would hit a domestic worker, often people with money and privilege and power, and whose abuses sometimes go unheard and unnoticed. And the domestic worker simply has to lose their job, suffer it, and go on. And I think, the ability to speak out about these stories, the ability to talk publicly about these stories, help to bring a certain amount of visibility, and especially given outlets like the New York Times, NPR, some of these major news outlets featured very big stories about the domestic workers and helped share these experiences. But what I argue is that the cost of this recognition was a need to conform to dominant myths and stereotypes that would resonate for a mainstream white liberal audience, right? And so what kind of myths and stereotypes would resonate were ones as workers presenting themselves as isolated, presenting themselves as sort of helpless and powerless and vulnerable. They couldn't appear angry. So I'll give you an example of this. With the story of Pat, she told in this story that was featured in the New York Times magazine. She tells this story about how she was hit by her employer, how he called her a bitch, how he called her all these really bad things, and in order to be sympathetic, the audience to be sympathetic, it's the story is presented as she is the victim and the powerless one, and suffering the abuses and insults of this guy. So I did an interview with her as well, in which I got a kind of different take on this. So when I was interviewing her, she said, she explained how the man was not being nice to his daughter, how she confronted him about it, and then she said, he punched me in the face and he called me a bitch, and I said he was the bigger bitch. None of that appeared in any of the news stories. It didn't appear in the legal stories. It didn't appear anywhere. But she said that's what happened to me, right? And so the question is, did she not tell the reporters when she was doing the interview? Did she did she tell the reporter and the reporter left it out because the report was trying to make the reader sympathetic to her? In any case, I think what it illustrated to me is that you can't have an angry domestic worker appear sympathetic, right? I mean, if any of you followed the whole case of the really tragic case of Yoselin Ortega, the Dominican nanny who killed the 2 children under her charge, and the really horrible reporting of the violent Mexican nanny, she wasn't even Mexican, but the way that the media kind of took on that story and really kind of all the, the sort of words used to describe her. There is no place for these representations for the domestic workers to appear upset, angry about their treatment. They have to constantly be in order to be sympathetic to a broad mainstream audience, they have to constantly remove their own feelings, their own anger, their own pain. They have to simply be victims who are sort of silently suffering, and so this is one thing I saw as fairly common in a lot of these stories. The other thing that the legal hearings ask people to do is just to focus on the conditions of work. Not to talk about the broader system of exploitation, not to talk about the broader system of inequality, not to talk about anything else, but to simply define, this is how much I got paid, I should have got paid that much, this is, how many days of work I was asked to do, how many days of a week I was asked to work. And so, again, the legal storytelling kind of cuts out, if we go back to that movement storytelling, the kinds of things people shared when they were together in a room and wanted to just talk to each other, the ways in which legal storytelling sort of excises out so much of that experience in order to fit, the narrow confines of a legal protocol, a submission to the courts, is ultimately, I argue, a major price to pay, right? We can, and this is, I think, the question is, yes, you can gain recognition, yes, you can even gain a Bill of Rights, but what is the cost for doing that if you have to make yourself palatable to a mainstream? Right? So, in terms of the media storytelling, like I mentioned, through their sort of their strategy, through the ways that they were able to appeal to major newspapers like the New York Times, they actually were able to get a series of favourable op-eds. Right before the bill was passed, they got a series of favourable op-eds. They got a whole lot of really positive kind of, supportive coverage in these newspapers. But I sort of want to break down a little bit, what are the kinds of things that these op-eds are arguing. So this is one by Stephen Greenhouse in a piece that he wrote on the domestic worker bill in 2007. And he quotes Ai-jen Poo, who was one of the founders of the organization DWU. So he says, these workers play a very important role in the state economy, said Ai-jen Poo, the founder of Domestic Workers United, a Bronx-based advocacy group. They work for the state's professional class, lawyers, doctors, financial people, media people, and their work makes it possible for all these people to go to work every day. Now, okay, this is like part of the messaging of the organization, which is, and it's true, domestic workers, their work makes it possible for other people to do their work, right? That was one of the sort of key elements of the campaign, that you can do your work because we look after your children. But at the same time, what this does is it makes them only sort of important in as far as what they can contribute to the state economy, right? This is why they are being valued, because they can help us, because they can help the state economy. This is another op-ed piece that was entitled Women's Work. And again, you would think that an op-ed piece titled Women's Work that was part of something like a feminist Bill of Rights campaign that was fighting for the rights of women workers would somehow have a critique of the gendered roles and gender division of labour. But again, this editorial says, perhaps most important, the bill would be a long overdue affirmation of the fundamental value of a little profession. Things will get better, the workers say, only when more people recognise their essential dignity and appreciate their skills at keeping a home and caring for children and the elderly. So there is, again, buying into the idea that this is their role. This is the appropriate task for women. This is the appropriate task for domestic workers. What it's doing is it's reinforcing the gender division of labour. It's reinforcing the idea that this is women's work is. See, women's work is to keep a home and caring for children and the elderly. It reinforces these ideas that this is their job, right? So it was in a very problematic way that the campaign messaging sort of fed into these tropes and stereotypes that the media then picked up on and used in their own op-ed pieces to reinforce things like gender divisions of labour and sort of the division of certain workers, women's work, and not just women's work, but the work done by women from the third world, women from the global south. They are the women who are the appropriate caretakers for our children, the ones who should be keeping the home and involved in this profession. And I should say that, so as I mentioned in the beginning, this campaign was a coalition of various different organizations, but not all of the organizations agreed with this strategy. And so there were some organizations, like I'd mentioned before, Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees, and they just didn't want to talk to the New York Times. They said, we've had bad experiences where our members have talked to big newspapers and they get misreported, or they talk about abuse in the workplace and then they can't find a job anymore after their name is used, after their whole story is put out there, and then they lose their job and nobody wants to hire them again. And so they had a totally different strategy, which was to use they were based out in the working class neighborhood of Flatbush, where they reached out to the local Haitian community by using sub-carrier radio stations, and they broadcast in Haitian Creole instead of, trying to report in English. And so they were able to then reach a completely different constituency, rather than reaching out only to a sort of middle-class audience who has one particular perspective. Their strategy was to reach out to the sort of domestic workers themselves, to the people who might employ domestic workers as family members, right? Because according to this organization, a lot of Haitian women are being brought out to work for family members. And there was a lot of exploitation taking place among those family members. And so this was one of the things that happened in this campaign, was there was not always agreement, and that Haitian women and another organization called Damayan was sort of putting forward some of the more critical perspectives about the stories that were being told, about the strategies that were being followed with the media, and trying to find different kinds of avenues. Okay, so I just wanted to share this example with you. This is one of the protocols that was being used at an Assembly Labour Committee hearing for the Bill of Rights campaign. So you can see the ways in which it's very directive, right? It's not, tell us, your experience as a domestic worker, or talk about what your history is. It's, what are your hours and schedule? What benefits do you get? The relationship, types of grievance procedures. It's very limited in scope, and this is part of my argument. So when there were at this Labour Committee hearing, I think there were say 10 stories that were told. When we read those stories, and some of them are really heart-wrenching stories, some of them are really horrible stories about the ways that people were sexually abused, about the ways that they were racially sort of abused and mistreated, and they're really touching stories. They're told really well, but the issue is when we read those stories, we can't take them at face value. We have to try to understand, how are people being how are their stories being shaped, right? And I think when there's a protocol in play, we have to take into account these are the things that are delineating the boundaries by which people, what people can and cannot say. I don't think I have that one, but there was actually one story that, this is it. So there was one story that that wasn't able to be told as an oral testimony, but was rather that she was invited to submit it as a written testimony because it didn't fit those protocols, right? This is a domestic worker, Marichu Baonan, and it's an anonymous domestic worker testifying on behalf of Marichu, who talks about, the 10 million Filipinos abroad who are treated as products in the global market, the $20 million that these women send back to help their families, right? It's talking about not just, this is how much I get paid, this is how much I should be paid. It's not just about, I don't want to work this many hours a week. It's about the fact that there is a global domestic work industry that uses the labor of these women in order to both earn foreign exchange for a government in crisis, for the government in the Philippines, but it's also about filling a care gap in the US, right? The government over the years has slowly withdrawn funding for childcare services, for elderly care, and this has resulted in more and more of a gap. And that gap is being filled by women from the global south, women from third world countries, who have to leave behind their own children, who have to leave behind their own families to come and look after women look after children in richer countries. And this is a fundamental problem, I think, that can't just be solved by saying, let's pay them better wages, let's get them work visas, let's make sure that they have good conditions. All of that is very important, but there is a deeper issue here, which is the global industry that profits, where governments profit out of these women's labour. And I think this is what some of their other stories show, the real inequality of why do some women have to leave their own children to be raised by other people? Why do they have to leave their homelands and their own families to leave and come to a different country to look after somebody else's children just because they're poor, right? Just because they have no opportunities. Shouldn't we be trying to question some of those bigger things? Shouldn't we be trying to question why they have to even leave in the first place, right? And so then that was, one of the things that we see in a testimony like this is she's not presenting herself as a victim. It's a very different strategy to, this is what happened to me, I was abused by my employer, this is what happened, and we need to pass a Bill of Rights so that things like this don't happen. But it's also saying, in addition to, this is the kind of abuse I faced, it's saying that this is why this abuse happens. It's rampant because this is an industry that profits off women's labour. And unless we put a stop to some of these bigger things, we're not going to find that. And so this is where, like this story and some of the ones I just want to talk about in conclusion are the more kinds of complicated stories that I think do what Sylvia and Hewitt talk about, do what Alessandra Portelli does, which is bring back in those different elements, the personal, the political, the collective, right? This is what she's doing here. She's not simply telling us a tale of individual harm and abuse by an individual bad employer. She's talking about a broader political, cultural, economic system. And by doing that, she's bringing in her position, her class position as a worker from the global south. She's bringing in the political system that profits from the abuse and exploitation of these women. She's telling a story that is on all of these different registers, and that's why, to me, that's not a curated story. That's the kind of example of the more subversive stories. So I just wanted to. One of the things that happened was in the aftermath, so the Bill of Rights campaign, the bill was passed in 2010, and I actually began my research after this campaign was over, so it's not like I was really present doing the research while the Bill of Rights campaign was happening. And so the kinds of things people were telling me in the interviews was more a reflection back on their experiences, what had happened. And talking to domestic workers, hearing from these different organizations, besides just BWU, who were involved in the coalition. And so two of the women, Chitra Iyer and Nahara, who were part of an organization, a domestic workers organization, one I mentioned before, Underlain, sort of critically thinking back on what were their experiences, right? What happened during this campaign, said that, they spoke about how a specific simple narrative is often encouraged, stories of exploitation and victimhood, with often the worst thing, right? Like it's the shock value of telling the most horrible story of what happened that is used in order to say, well, let's put this out there to get the media attention. But then followed by this trajectory of empowerment and upliftment. And that was the way that the Bill of Rights stories often went. They said, I had this horrible experience, my bad employer did this to me, but then I went and I fought for the Bill of Rights campaign, and that's how I became empowered. And so this is what they're talking about here, the simple narrative followed by the smooth trajectory of empowerment. They say we've been critical of the ways in which these stories have been framed, and have also begun to realize the ways in which we may have been complicit, right? And so how did the workers themselves start telling these stories? Why did they tell them? This is what, in the aftermath, I came across a lot of different organizations and groups who were beginning to ask some of these questions. So another example of this is the domestic worker Christine Lewis, and she worked with a writer called Mark Nowak with the Penn World Voices Festival, and has been sort of working to say what kinds of more complex stories can we tell, what kind of more complicated stories can we tell. So I have a video also here to share.
You take it easy to look for legacy, old money on plantations of privilege. I mean ritzy 50 and 60th. It's a cent, a look about $1 that can do you like that. They want everything done. Yet stiff you what you will. For this colored girl, it would the money she's worth. At least so they think. And by the way, this is a domestic workers, a babysitter, caregiver, housekeeper's food. Said the woman with a colorful calypso accent. They give you fever. Fever? It hurts. And it's a hurting fever. Intent to set you back. I know. 19 years. July 2003 was the last. I left with a week's pay, could barely buy a loaf of Miss Butterfield designer's rag. Much less cow's milk. It is my 5th eviction note. Legacy and old money can do you like that. I never missed a day. I cooked, shopped, laundered, Victoria's Secret, and plenty secrets. Polished pristine baseboard in O'Neill's room. Clean the cracks of alabaster babies as I recite Harold and the purple crayon till I turn blue. Engineer baby swing prom toy trains. Plan play date and fate. Walk dog along an avenue that reeks of dough. Being mindful to scoop up shit after Fido and not to get a fine. Hoping that the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights would make things right. 19 years, no severance. Talk of money gets funny. What do you think I'm worth? Madam asks, what do you think is fair? Certainly not the 2 hand-me-down end tables from your Aunt Bessie's collection. 19 years, no severance. 5 eviction note. Said the pleasingly plump woman with a colorful calypso accent. They give you fever. Fever?
So I just wanted to play that to give you an example of these are the kinds of counter stories, right? To the ones, the media stories, to the ones that are being told in the legal hearings, in the Senate, in Albany. These are the alternative stories that domestic workers sort of started to tell through these workshops and started to think about some of their broader conditions in this period. I just want to end by, and sorry, just to add one more, which is how Aya and Alam from Underlain had also talked about, domestic workers and saying, well, not all of domestic workers want to talk about domestic work, right? So again, going back to that protocol, what are your hours, what are your conditions, or the media interviews, tell me about the abuse you suffered by your employer. It's this constant asking to tell stories of harm that I think a lot of people got frustrated with, and they said, we're not defined by being domestic workers, and we're 3-dimensional beings, which ultimately allow the audience to connect in a much deeper manner. Maybe they want to talk about their children, maybe they want to talk about their marriage or the liberation war in Bangladesh. This is, when we think about how, going back to Protelli and the different levels, to only focus on one aspect of somebody's being, to only focus on the abuse or harm they suffered as a result of a work experience, really cuts out so much of who they are as people and really simplifies them as human beings. And so then if we turn that question and we say to the domestic worker, instead of tell us your story of harm, right? That's what they're told in the courts. That's what they're asked by the journalists. That's what they're asked over and over and over to do, and they're sick of doing. Maybe we change the question to say, what do you want to talk about? If you want to tell me your story, what story do you want to tell me? And this is what's so interesting that they're saying, right? If you ask them, they may say, I want to talk about my kids. I want to talk about the liberation war. Why should they only have to talk about one thing? just wanted to sort of mention this because I thought it connected with some of the themes of the seminar on oral history and the idea of the oral history project. So, this organisation, Underlain, is actually working towards building a physical and multimedia archive, and to think about putting together the history and experiences of Underlain as a low-wage immigrant women's workers collective. And so just sort of in this quote here, they said we want to do oral histories that are accessible to advocates, academics and activists, to the next generation of organisers. We want to encourage people not just to give a sugar-coated tribute to the group, but to be honest about what worked and didn't work. And so in telling these complex, contradictory stories, this is how we can best determine what's next for Underlain. So I thought that was a sort of interesting tie into some of the themes of this particular series, but also a nice sort of fitting, sort of postscript to this example of the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights campaign, that in the end, that this was a way they found to be able to tell different, oral history was a way that the domestic workers found to be able to tell different kinds of stories to the media storytelling and to the legal storytelling that was so prominent within that campaign. So I'll leave it there because we've got, I think, 20 minutes for discussion. I'd love to hear people's questions.
Thank you so much. And I'll let you take questions as you.
Yeah.
I'm always going to have a question. So this issue of mainstream media versus other forms of media is something I've struggled with. You've heard, my own personal story about issues. But I think there's a challenge that we don't talk about enough. That there are organizations that salivate for that mainstream media. And mainstream media doesn't like stories that aren't sexy, I always like to say, right? So during my days of Picture the Homeless, you're not going to sit down with somebody from CBS News and talk about, people on the street and how people got to know. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear, woe is me. And I'm not into that. I want to talk about those 3 points I did, the collective, the political. So I wonder if you got into any conversations with any of those groups. I know you probably have, but I think that's a real issue because there are indie media types who will craft the stories. They come from the same places we do. They understand the issue, right? They're doing social justice media versus that mainstream media where the woe is me, right? Because I've always felt that you use the term complicit. I don't know if you saw me rose up. It's a word I've been drilling David with lately. He's been driving him crazy. I often say to him, how much are we complicit in our own problems? If we share those narratives. I refuse. It's the same things on panel, right? There are 4 of us on the panel saying the same things to the same one. I'm not doing it anymore. Put somebody up here next to me who wants to debate. I think that's more useful, right? So I just, I know I spewed it out, but it just raised an awareness in me when you said that. There's that challenge within the organization, the members, and I'll say the members may want to do it one way, and the staff and some of the folks who directed these organizations may want to do it another way because they have different goals.
And as Nina said to me, having one of your members quoted in the New York Times, it's great on a funding application, right? So there are certain reasons why people appeal to certain media, rather than doing, they sort of do it as an either or, rather than doing what Haitian women did, which was that base building work, reaching out to people in Haitian Creole. Nobody's going to, sort of recognize that in a funding grant.
Right.
And so, but I think, there's like, Amy and I were actually at a conference earlier this year in Pennsylvania where there were some fantastic groups. There was an organization called Media Mobilizing Project.
I know them well.
Yeah, Brian Mercer.
Movements begin with the telling of untold stories. I quote them all the time.
Yes, and I was so impressed with the kind of work they're doing because they're trying to reach the media, but not with, saying, well, we'll use the tropes that appeal to you. No, I mean, it's like changing that narrative, right? And making sure that that the media can listen to them. And I thought that was a really interesting and different approach.
They're a perfect group for that. That's their focus, ladies.
It was great. Yes.
I had a question, or I'm trying to discern 2 different moments. So it feels like the moment of the legislative hearing is a very particular And I'm curious, as you think about changing the narrative in a longer arc,
Yeah.
how does that enable them in those moments where it's a tactical moment to tell a different story? Because sometimes it's hard in a tactical moment where you're trying to get someone to listen at all, and so you end up telling a tactical story.
Yes.
And how do you do that longer work to change the story
Yeah.
so it allows for a broader spectrum more readily, maybe?
Right. Well, one of the things that I argued in the book was at the beginning of the Bill of Rights campaign in 2004, this was the vision they had, which was we'll tell the tactical stories, we'll kind of fit, that model to be able to see that as one front of our struggle, but it's only one place, it's only one area. We need all these other arenas in which we're developing our analysis and developing an analysis of the globe of imperialism, the broader global conditions of the work industry, of all of these other spheres. We continue the base building. That was how they started off, and it was interesting how in those years all of those other things kind of dropped out, and this tactical sort of stories at the legal storytelling became the only approach. And so that's where I see it as a problem. It's not a problem in and of itself. I think we can definitely see the tactical uses. It's a problem, and this was exactly the same with the Marshall Gans Obama camp storytelling. Is it storytelling and that kind of advocacy storytelling was the only thing. It was devoid of other community organizing techniques and strategies of a broader vision of social change, to the point where by the end of the campaign, the Bill of Rights that was passed was a much more weak bill than what was originally proposed in 2004 by the domestic workers, and yet it was celebrated as a symbolic victory. And the next step was seen, rather than even trying to get implementation of this weak bill, was like, let's go to states across the country. Let's go to Illinois, let's go to California, Massachusetts, let's pass the same bill. And people like Minaj and others were saying, why not try to get a better bill than what New York got? Why not try to implement this bill, right? And so that, I think, is the main issue. And that if all of those other things could be done at the same time, then I think tactical storytelling at the legislature could actually have an impact.
You've gestured a little bit towards it by talking about fundraising, but can you say more about what are the forces that push movements towards this kind of tactical approach? Like, why did they end up doing that and not the other thing?
Yeah. So, we over the years, beginning with the sort of early years of the legislative campaign, Domestic Workers United began to get more and more funding from the Ford Foundation, other big foundations, for legal advocacy. And they were very channeled into this because, their first round was like $482,000, which is a lot of money for a small organization that had been, sort of on a shoestring budget, volunteer labor, began to get more and more money. By the time NDWA had formed in the aftermath of the bill, they received, I think it was 2011 or 2012, I say in the book, they received nearly $5 million, mostly given for litigation and advocacy and legal advocacy. And so there's a way in which the big dollars can really push people in a particular direction, but one of the things that really worries me is it takes away the democracy of the movement, right? Because where are the decisions being made? Who's deciding that you follow the legal advocacy path? The people at the foundation who are coming up with the categories in which they do grant making. It's not the worker members, it's not the steering committee, it's not that those organizations themselves. When you're getting that kind of money, the decisions are being made outside the organization. And that was a sort of clear case of the way that this campaign unfolded. They moved from much more radical organization, much more sort of grassroots type organization with a broader analysis, to one that saw the legal sphere and passing these bills across the country as really the only, sort of path. Yeah.
And so thank you for such an incredibly elegant and smart and helpful talk. So Alessandro Patelli is probably my best friend in the world, other than Lionel Brealey, sitting right here. And I've studied with him over the years and been to Italy and traveled with him. And the kind of work he does started with a group called Circula Vocio. And these are communities who were in farms around Italy that were revolutionary communities. And he still maintains that Circula Vocio as site, as his main place of inspiration in Rome, where young people would get together and sing and play music and create their own documentaries, and it's a multi-generational storytelling and story making. sense. And then they're also very close to the people. The Italian resistance basically was what that was. And the folk singers, you know, still they meet together, they plan together. I think this is where Sandra got this triadal kind of thing of the person, the community, and the state. But they're activists, meaning that they're always planning the next demonstration. Or they're going out to sing at night at a protest or something. So this is a living community. The Highlander Center here in the U.S. was founded in the same kind of way as a folk center for its first 10 or 15 years. And the same kind of process of going into the deeper and multi-level stories that you're talking about, the complex stories. So that was a focus, and I just wonder if the storytelling, the shorter focused storytelling advocacy movement could be deliberately shifted through workshops you might give, or other people might give, oral history workshops, in which you outline what happens in a Bertelli model, or a Ferrarian model, or something like that, and you constantly shift between the story and the movement. I mean, it sounds like it could be done.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, for instance, that's something that Mark Nowak has been doing, and I think he's been doing pretty well in bringing together like the Worker Writers Group, and I've been to a few of the conferences that he's organized. He does this Governor's Island, he does these kind of summer workshops, and he, you know, brings these kind of techniques, not so much oral history. This is actually, I haven't seen oral history as much until like this project with Underlain, but you know, he's coming more from a sort of literary perspective. But I think all of these, the oral history, the literary perspectives, all of these perspectives can give us a different kind of angle to the sort of advocacy, tell your story, you know, sort of strategist approach, which has become, I mean, there are entire kind of volumes written on storytelling for grant making.
Oh,
you know,
I know.
it's really quite incredible. But no, that's, I mean, I think that's a great idea. I unfortunately don't live in New York anymore, and in Sydney.
I was going to say we should get together.
No. Well, in Sydney where I live, it's interesting because there's not really, I mean, there's a lot of childcare workers, but there's not domestic workers in the same way. There's not migration of, you know, women in the same way to look after people's children as there is here in other global cities.
But there's a big oral history movement.
Yes, yes.
I have a question, which is that, I mean, something that seems like it would be really difficult to work with is the fact that a lot of these institutions, whether they're like media organizations like the New York Times or legislative bodies, are used to hearing stories that are told within certain parameters and assumptions. So if you know, even if they're, even if domestic workers are telling a story and like laying out the political, economic context and as they see it, or as maybe say it's more true, that wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if those organizations would respond to that, and I'm wondering how you've seen that play out, and if you come upon strategies that have been used to make that more potent somehow.
So sorry, when you say organizing, you mean the media outlets are not as open to people telling, like, so for instance, the Bannons story that she talks about would find a hard time finding place in a New York Times editorial.
Yeah, like, I mean, even the fact that I think, you know, even progressive news outlets or journalists can fall into societal assumptions when they're telling a story. Like, it's not necessarily like that they're consciously like, oh, we're just going to tell this very simple story of a victim, but that this is the way that we're used to stories being told.
Yeah. No, and I completely agree that there's this sort of, you know, broader structures of hegemony, the way that the media operates, the way that Stuart Hall talks a lot about. And I think, to me, it comes down to the strength of organized movements themselves being able to create that space. And the one group I've seen do this really successfully, especially recently, is the New York Taxi Workers Alliance. You know, all of the sort of the driver suicides that have been taking place, all of their fight against Uber, they've managed to get the kind of coverage in papers like the New York Times that often quotes, you know, the workers, quotes the leaders of the movement in ways that do carry across their message. But that also comes from a really kind of dedicated, organized
organization that is consistently kind of working to do that. And I think, that's a different approach to saying, what will the media want? How can we fit in with what they're going to want and get our story in there? You get the story in there, but is it one that really is more deeply challenging some of these assumptions?
Suji, can I follow it? Well, let the lady ask her question first, and then I'll follow.
I'm a part of alternative media, and every time I hear the New York Times, I sort of flinch. Because, with the news cycles that we're exposed to, with the social scientific goals momentarily moving on to the next thing, for those who are choosing this path of documenting real life stories, I'd like to ask, what obligations do they have once gathering this information to be able to give back to those sources beyond what a grant would offer them, and not just to have that sort of moment in the headline with so-called history in there.
So you're talking about what obligation reporters have to...
Or those pursuing this path of
Research.
being able to do this research and document, and not just be so reliant on the purview of so-called history.
Yeah. So I think if we're talking about researchers, right, who go and who do oral histories with people and who use that oral history in their research, I think people have talked about participatory research and collaborative research, and I think we have an obligation to see that we don't use stories in the way that I feel the critique of a lot of domestic workers was our stories were used to build other people's careers. And you often hear that in, with, whether it's journalists or whether it's whoever it is, that their stories are all sort of, somebody's having a gala and they bring out somebody to tell their story, or, during the election campaigns, how people are brought to stand next to the presidential candidate and to tell their story. There's that sense of people feeling used when their stories are brought, and I think there's the other sense in which we can actually see how the stories we collect and the forms we present them in can give back and be useful and valuable to the organizations and communities from which those stories come. And sometimes that can be done, in collaboration. I'm sure there's so many people in this room who've been involved with those kind of projects, and you probably have more experience than me with that, but I just think, that's really key, rather than that first model where you sort of use the story to then promote yourself in some way, that there's a way that you can ask the people who tell the stories how those stories can be presented in a way that's useful to them.
And just a brief follow-up, in terms of your writing the book, your give back, were there any participants in these actions able to develop the skills or the encouragement and support to write their own story?
So here's the thing, I think as a result of what had happened, the way stories have been used, some people just didn't want to tell their stories. There was a feeling of, I'm tired of telling my story. I just want to do something different. I don't want to tell my story right now, and that's okay. I think that refusal or silence also points to a weariness with this particular model, and maybe they do something different. With the Dreamers, they sort of said that, and then started doing different kinds of things like art or video storytelling or different kinds of formats, and so when I was and that was the point in which I came in, right, which was finding people at this point of being fed up of telling their stories and saying, is there something different that we can do right now? So, Rob, did you?
Yeah, I just want to follow up quickly with two examples of the question I was asked here. I think two, and both of them relate to, well, one of them relates to my time in Picture the Homeless. In 2009, we took over a lot on 115th Street and Madison Avenue. And there was a writer that we had a relationship with that was writing for the New York Times. I think Amy knows him well. I don't want to put the name out there, but this is a writer that the movement knows and trusts. And this writer was live on the scene and started blogging live on the Times. And the feed was picked up by CNN. Before you know it, CNN is calling Max Rameau, who was to take back the land, and it just started the cycle of mainstream media seeing this lot takeover in Harlem, but really getting the voices of people on the ground who were in the struggle and why they were doing it. And I think it turned out to be a great article. It ended up hitting the Times as a written article from a blog. The second was in 2010 at this very university in the law school. There was a pre-meeting before the Universal Periodic Review, which the United States is going to go for the first time in Geneva, Switzerland. 20 high-level government officials were here to attend this meeting. Department of Justice, Department of Education, Health and Human Services, HUD, you name it, either the secretary or deputy secretary were here. And they all agreed to do a tour of housing conditions in Harlem. And myself and Eric Tars from National Law Center took them on a tour of Harlem. It's 20 inches of snow, February 2010, the meeting still happened, and we took them up in the grand houses. But in the room, they said, you can't have any reporters or anybody in the room. There's a young lady who graduated from the School of Journalism here and who was working as a paid intern for the New York Times. I don't want to mention her name because I don't want to get her in any trouble, but I just said, when everybody asked me who she was, she should identify herself. I kept saying she was a Nesri intern. She was writing for the Times. And she followed us into these public housing. All these elected officials are on camera going up into the grand houses in Harlem. People's reactions were freaking out, but there was a level of trust that was built. The movement trusted this young lady to do the right thing. So I think there's relationship building that can be done to make this happen in a way that it's going to benefit the work on the ground, and it's not just going to suck out and build a career, and it's not going to fit into that mold of what your editor told you should come back with as a story. These were people that were able to write a story that has some value.
That's so helpful. I want to also make a shout out to Groundswell Oral History for Social Change, which is a network of people doing exactly this kind of oral history work that you're describing, trying to use oral history specifically in the context of serving social movements and telling these more complicated stories to make a different kind of change. So if people want to get involved with that, it's a great way to learn more about this kind of work. Our next event is 2 weeks from now in the same room with Eric Marcus, who's the creator of the Making Gay History podcast. And we're taking kind of a different angle on the topic of that one. We're looking at when we make our oral history archives, we imagine them being used in a future. Eric made an archive decades ago that he's now reusing to make this podcast. So we're asking, like, now that we're living in the future that he made this for, what do these oral histories mean? And I think it's going to be a really great event. So I invite you all to come back. And thank you so much. And thank you all again for coming. Please keep around and have a glass of wine if you like.